There's a family in America that doesn't exist in your history books. No monuments, no museum exhibits, no documentary crews knocking on their doors. They live in a cluster of towns so small you'd miss them if you blinked while driving through. And for over 200 years, they've kept something locked inside their bloodline that science can't fully explain and that they refuse to talk about. Their genetic markers, the biological fingerprints that make us who we are, haven't changed in centuries. Not because of coincidence, not because of isolation alone, but because of something far more deliberate, something that started as survival and became a cage they built themselves. In 1823, a group of families fleeing religious persecution settled in a valley so remote that maps didn't bother marking it for another 40 years. They were farmers, devout, terrified of the outside world and what it had done to them. So they made a pact. They would marry only within their group. They would keep their bloodlines pure. They would create a fortress made not of stone, but of DNA, and it worked. For generations, they thrived in their isolation. But purity has a price, and that price is written in their bones, their faces, their medical records that doctors are forbidden to discuss publicly. This isn't a story about a cult. It's not about religious extremism or backwoods mythology. It's about what happens when a group of people decides that the world outside is so dangerous, so corrupting, that they would rather gamble with their own biology than risk contamination, and the gamble is still going. Right now, in towns you've driven past, in faces you wouldn't look at twice, because they've learned how to hide what they are. But the genes don't lie, and the records, the ones that survive, tell a story that feels less like history and more like a warning. The first generation didn't see the consequences. They saw only safety. 23 families, bound by faith and fear, planting roots in soil that seemed to accept them when nothing else would. They built churches before they built homes. They prayed before they planted, and when their children came of age, they married each other, cousins to cousins, second cousins to second cousins. It wasn't scandalous to them. It was sacred, a covenant written not just in scripture, but in blood. By the third generation, the patterns began to show. A child born with 6 fingers on each hand. Another who couldn't hear, though there was no illness, no injury. A boy whose jaw grew at an angle that made eating painful. These weren't seen as warning signs. They were seen as tests of faith. God's will made flesh. The families prayed harder, married closer, believed that their devotion would be rewarded, and in a way, it was. Because they survived, they grew in number, and the outside world forgot they existed. But genetics doesn't forget. Every time 2 people with shared ancestry have a child, the deck gets shuffled with fewer cards. Recessive traits, the hidden ones, the ones that stay dormant in diverse populations, start surfacing. Eye colors that don't quite match human norms, bone structures that seem too uniform, blood types clustering in ways that shouldn't be statistically possible. By the 1870s, doctors visiting the area began keeping notes, private notes, the kind that never made it into official records, but were passed between colleagues in whispered conversations. Notes about a community where everyone looked like variations of the same face. One physician wrote in his journal, never published, that he had delivered 19 babies in the span of 2 years in these towns, and that 14 of them shared an identical birthmark on their left shoulder blade. A crescent shape, dark as a bruise. He called it the mark of the valley. He didn't call it what it was, a genetic signature, a flag planted in their DNA by generations of the same families circling back on themselves, creating patterns that nature never intended. And those patterns didn't stop. They deepened, they became architecture, and the families, even as they began to understand what was happening, made a choice. They decided that staying pure was worth the cost. Whatever that cost became, by the early 1900s, the outside world began to notice, not because the families wanted attention, but because the medical anomalies became impossible to ignore. A state health inspector arrived in 1908 to investigate reports of an unusually high infant mortality rate. What he found didn't make it into his official report. What he found made it into a letter he sent to a colleague at Johns Hopkins, a letter that stayed sealed in an archive until 1987. He described a community where nearly 30% of children didn't survive past age 5, where deafness appeared in 1 out of every 4 families, where a specific form of skeletal dysplasia, condition so rare it appeared in medical literature only twice before, was common enough that the families had a name for it in their own dialect. They called it the bending. The inspector wrote that he sat with a mother who had buried 6 children. She told him, without emotion, that this was God's winnowing, that the weak were taken so the strong could carry on. She said it while holding her 7th child, a daughter whose legs were already beginning to curve inward in a way that would make walking difficult by adolescence. He asked her if she ever thought about marrying someone from outside the valley. She looked at him like he'd suggested burning down the church. She told him that her husband was her second cousin, just as her father had married his second cousin, just as it had always been. She told him that their blood was clean, that the world outside was sick with sin and disease and mixings that offended God. And when he tried to explain genetics, tried to tell her that the very thing she feared from the outside was happening inside her own family, she asked him to leave. He left, and he never went back, but his letter included something else, measurements. He had taken photographs with permission of 12 adults from the community. He noted that 11 of them had an identical cranial structure, the same ratio of forehead to jaw, the same spacing between the eyes, the same angle of cheekbone. He wrote that standing in a room with them felt like standing in a hall of mirrors, each reflection slightly distorted but unmistakably from the same source. He wrote that he couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at one person, fractured across time, and he was right. By then, the genetic bottleneck was so narrow that the families weren't just related. They were echoes, copies of copies, the diversity that protects a population from disease, from mutation, from collapse. It was gone, and still they kept marrying inward, because to marry out was to lose everything. To admit that the sacrifice had been for nothing, that the children buried in the valley cemetery had died not for faith, but for fear. In 1952, a geneticist from the University of Pennsylvania heard whispers about the valley, not through official channels, but through a retired country doctor who drank too much and talked about the things he'd seen in his 40 years of practice. The geneticist's name was Dr. Marion Thresh. She specialized in inherited disorders, and she had spent years studying isolated populations, Amish communities, Appalachian settlements, island populations where the gene pool had narrowed. But nothing prepared her for what she found when she finally convinced 3 families to participate in her study. She collected blood samples, took family histories going back 6 generations, built genealogical charts that looked less like family trees and more like tangled webs, lines crossing and recrossing until it was impossible to tell where one family ended and another began. And when the results came back from the lab, she sat in her office for 3 hours, checking and rechecking the data because she didn't believe what she was seeing. The genetic diversity within the community was comparable to that of an endangered species on the brink of extinction. Certain gene variants that should appear in less than 1% of any population were present in over 40% of her sample group, and there were markers, specific sequences, that she couldn't find in any reference database. Not because they were new, but because they were old. so old and so isolated that they existed nowhere else in the modern human population. Dr. Thresh wrote in her notes that it was like discovering a branch of humanity that had split off and evolved separately, not over thousands of years, but over a handful of generations through sheer genetic compression. She wanted to publish. She wanted to bring in more researchers to document what was happening before it was too late. But the families refused. They had allowed her in as a courtesy, because one elder believed she might help them understand why so many children were being born with heart defects. When she told them the answer, that their practice of intermarriage had concentrated a lethal recessive gene, they thanked her politely and asked her never to return. She honored that request. But her unpublished research stayed in her files, and before she died in 1979, she gave an interview to a graduate student. She said that the saddest part wasn't the genetic damage, it was that the families knew. By the 1950s, they knew what was happening. They had doctors explain it. They had geneticists beg them to introduce new bloodlines, and they refused, not out of ignorance, but out of identity. Because to change would mean admitting that everything they had sacrificed, every child lost, every disability endured, had been for nothing, and that admission was more unbearable than any birth defect. The children born in the 1970s and 80s grew up in a world that was beginning to crack open. Television arrived, roads improved. The outside world wasn't just a concept anymore. It was sitting in their living rooms every night, showing them what life looked like beyond the valley. And some of them started to ask questions, questions their parents didn't want to answer. Questions about why everyone in their school looked vaguely related, why the same last names appeared on every mailbox, every gravestone, every church pew, why their own family trees didn't branch. They spiraled. One woman, who left the community in 1991, agreed to an interview years later on the condition of anonymity. She described growing up knowing that her grandmother was also her great-aunt, that her father's cousin was also her mother's nephew. She said the adults spoke about it in careful language, like describing a room in the house that everyone knew existed but no one ever entered. She said that by the time she was 14, she had attended the funerals of 6 children in her extended family, all under the age of 10. All from genetic conditions that doctors said were preventable with genetic diversity. And when she asked her mother why they didn't marry people from outside, her mother said, "Because we are not like them, and we will not become like them." She left at 19, married someone she met 3 states away, had 2 healthy children, and she said that even now, 30 years later, she still feels the weight of what she escaped, because her siblings stayed, her cousins stayed, and they're still doing it. The youngest generation, born in the 2000s and 2010s, they carry the same markers, the same compressed bloodlines, the same genetic time bombs waiting in their cells. Some of them know. They've taken DNA tests, seen the results, understood what the percentages mean, and still, most of them stay. They marry within the community, they have children, they pass it on. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have been the one to leave, knowing it might mean exile from everyone you've ever known? Or would you have stayed, hoping that faith and love could somehow overwrite biology, because that's the choice they face? And it's not hypothetical. It's happening right now, in towns whose names we're not sharing because the families still live there, because their children still go to school there, because they've built walls not just around their gene pool, but around their entire existence. And those walls are painted with generations of grief. Modern genetic testing has made hiding impossible. In 2003, a young man from the community submitted his DNA to one of those ancestry websites. He was curious. He wanted to see the percentages, the ethnic breakdown, maybe find some distant relatives who'd left generations ago. What he got back was a report that flagged his sample for medical review. The company's algorithm detected consanguinity, shared ancestry between his parents, at a level typically only seen in the children of first cousins or closer. But his parents weren't first cousins. They were second cousins, once removed, which meant that their parents had also been closely related, and their parents before them. The concentration was so severe that his DNA looked like it had passed through a genetic funnel, squeezed and compressed, until there was barely any variation left. He showed the report to his family. They weren't surprised. They were angry that he'd sent their blood to strangers, angry that he'd exposed what they'd worked so hard to keep private, because by the 2000s they knew the world would judge them. They knew that terms like inbreeding and genetic disorders would be used against them, that they'd be turned into a spectacle, a cautionary tale, a punchline on internet forums. So they'd stopped talking to outsiders, stopped allowing researchers in, stopped keeping medical records that could be traced. They went underground, genetically speaking, but the DNA doesn't care about secrecy. It tells the truth whether you want it to or not. Medical professionals in the surrounding areas have seen the consequences firsthand. One pediatric specialist who worked in a clinic near the community for 15 years described a pattern she couldn't discuss publicly until she retired. She treated multiple children from the valley for a rare metabolic disorder that appears in approximately 1 in 200,000 births in the general population. In her practice, covering a population of maybe 800 people from the community, she saw 9 cases. 9. The statistical anomaly was so extreme that she contacted the CDC. They investigated quietly. They found that the disorder was linked to a recessive gene that both parents had to carry. In a diverse population, the odds of 2 carriers meeting and having children are astronomically low. But in the valley where everyone shared ancestry, the odds became a near certainty. The CDC wrote a report. It was never released publicly. The community leaders met with health officials and requested that any findings be kept confidential, citing religious freedom and the right to privacy. The officials agreed under the condition that genetic counseling be offered. It was. Almost no one accepted it, because accepting counseling meant admitting the problem, and admitting the problem meant questioning the foundation their entire world was built on. So the counselors came and went. The reports were filed away, and the births continued. Each one a roll of dice weighted by 2 centuries of the same bloodlines circling back on themselves. Today, the community still exists. Smaller than it was, quieter. Some of the younger generation have left, taking their genes with them, diluting the concentration with each marriage outside the valley. But the core remains. The families who believe that leaving would be betrayal, that marrying out would be erasure, that their identity is inseparable from their blood, and so they continue, not out of ignorance, not out of stupidity, but out of something far more human and far more tragic, the belief that they've come too far to turn back now. A genetic counselor who worked with the community in the 2010s said something that stayed with her long after she left. She was speaking with a woman in her 30s, pregnant with her 4th child. The woman had already lost 1 child to a genetic heart defect. Another had severe developmental delays. The counselor gently suggested that she and her husband, who were 3rd cousins, consider adopting or using a sperm donor to reduce the genetic risk. The woman listened politely, and then she said, "If we do that, what are we? If our children don't carry our blood, the real blood, then what have we been protecting all this time?" The counselor had no answer, because the question wasn't really about genetics. It was about meaning, about whether the suffering of generations could be justified, or whether it had all been a terrible mistake compounded by pride and fear and the human inability to admit we were wrong. The woman had her fourth child. The child was born healthy, but the counselor said she thinks about that conversation often, about how much we're willing to sacrifice to maintain an identity, about how biology doesn't care what we believe. It just is. There are approximately 300 people left in the core community now. Their genetic markers are documented in databases they don't know exist. Researchers study them in academic papers that never use their real names. They've become a case study in what happens when a population isolates itself so completely that it stops being a community and becomes an experiment no one designed, an experiment that's still running. And the results are written in the faces of children who look like ghosts of their ancestors, in medical records that read like horror stories, in cemetery plots that hold more infants than elders. The families don't see themselves as victims. They don't want your pity. They believe they've preserved something pure in a world that's lost its way. And maybe they have. Maybe there's something in their blood that exists nowhere else on earth. Something that will be studied long after the last of them is gone. Or maybe there's just loss, generation after generation of loss, dressed up in the language of faith and sacrifice. Either way, their story isn't over. It's just hidden, buried in valleys too small for maps, in bloodlines too tangled to trace, in a choice made 200 years ago that their descendants are still paying for, one birth, one defect, one funeral at a time. And the question that haunts anyone who learns their story is simple: at what point does preservation become extinction? At what point does purity become poison? They don't have an answer, and maybe, after all this time, there isn't one. There's only what remains, and what remains is them, still there, still marrying, still believing, still waiting for the world to prove them right, while their genes tell a different story, a story that ends the only way it ever could. In silence, in isolation, in blood that remembered everything, even when the people tried to forget.